On July 17, 1453, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, the greatest English general of his generation, stood outside the town of Castillon in southwestern France and made a decision that would kill him, destroy his army, and end England's dream of ruling France forever. Talbot was 75 to 80 years old, a veteran of 40 years of the 100 Years' War, a man who had fought at Agincourt's generation and won dozens of battles through traditional English tactics. Longbow dismounted knights, defensive positions, and superior discipline. He had been captured, ransomed, returned to fighting, and become legendary as the English Achilles. Now, in the summer of 1453, he commanded perhaps 6,000 English soldiers trying to hold the last scraps of English territory in Gascony against the French reconquest. The French army besieging Castillon numbered approximately 10,000, but more importantly, they had something new. 300 cannon and culverins commanded by the Bureau brothers, Jean and Gaspard, master artillerists who had revolutionized French warfare. These guns were positioned in an entrenched artillery park, protected by earthworks, ditches, and palisades. A fortified position specifically designed to lure the English into attacking. Talbot knew the French had artillery. He knew they were entrenched. He knew attacking fortified positions with cavalry and infantry against mass guns was suicide. But he also knew that if Castillon fell, the last major town in English Gascony would be lost, and with it 300 years of English presence in France. Talbot decided to attack immediately with the forces he had, believing that speed and shock would overcome French guns before they could be effectively deployed. He was catastrophically wrong. The Battle of Castillon lasted less than an hour. French artillery systematically butchered the English army. Cannonballs weighing 20 to 60 pounds smashed through armored knights, ripping men and horses apart. Smaller cover and shot created clouds of lead balls that shredded infantry formations. John Talbot himself was killed when his horse was hit by cannon fire and fell on him, crushing the old general beneath its weight. His son, also named John, died trying to rescue his father. Perhaps 4,000 English soldiers were killed in that single afternoon. Their bodies left scattered across the field outside Castillon, many burned or charred by gunpowder explosions. The survivors fled. The English dream of ruling France, which had begun with William the Conqueror in 1066 and been pursued obsessively since Edward Roman III claimed the French throne in 1337, died with Talbot at Castillon. The 100 Years' War was over, medieval cavalry warfare was obsolete, the age of gunpowder had begun. To understand why the Battle of Castillon was so devastating for England, you must understand the context of 1453. The 100 Years' War, which had begun in 1337 when Edward Roman III of England claimed the French throne, had consumed both kingdoms for 116 years. The war had gone through multiple phases. In the early period, England won spectacular victories at Siersuai in 1346, Pier in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415, using longbow tactics to destroy French cavalry. By 1420, through the Treaty of Chivalry, the English King Henry V had forced France to recognize his claim to the French throne and married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. It appeared England would rule France, but Henry V died in 1422, leaving his infant son Henry VI as heir to both England and France. The French, led by Joan of Arc, and later by competent commanders and reformed armies, began winning territory back. By 1453, England held only Cala in the north and a shrinking territory in Gascony in the southwest. The English position was collapsing, not just militarily, but financially and politically. The war had bankrupted England. The nobility was exhausted. King Henry VI was mentally unstable and would soon descend into the madness that would trigger the Wars of the Roses. English public opinion had turned against the war, but the English still held Bordeaux and its surrounding region, and the Gascon nobility remained loyal to England, which had ruled them since Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry Roman II in 1152. This was the last fragment of England's continental empire. In the summer of 1453, the French King Charles Roman II launched a campaign to conquer Gascony and expel the English permanently. His commanders were experienced, his army was well supplied and numerous, and most importantly, he had the Bureau brothers and their artillery. Jean Bureau and his brother Gaspard were master gunners who had spent years developing French artillery capabilities. They had cast hundreds of bronze and iron cannon of various sizes, from massive bombards that fired stone balls weighing 100 lb to smaller culverins that fired lead shot. They had developed mobile gun carriages that allowed artillery to move with the army. They had trained professional gun crews, and they had pioneered the use of entrenched artillery parks, fortified positions where guns were placed behind earthworks, making them nearly invulnerable to cavalry charges while allowing them to fire continuously at attacking forces. This was revolutionary. Previous artillery had been used primarily for sieges, battering down castle walls. The Bureau brothers used artillery as battlefield weapons to destroy armies. The French army besieging Castillon in July 1453 included approximately 300 guns positioned in a fortified camp on a small ridge outside the town. This camp was surrounded by ditches, earthwork ramparts, and wooden palisades. The guns were arranged in batteries to create overlapping fields of fire. It was not a traditional army camp, but a purpose-built killing ground designed to slaughter any force foolish enough to attack it. John Talbot arrived at Castillon on July 17th with approximately 60 men, a mixed force of English archers, dismounted men-at-arms, and mounted knights. Talbot was one of the last surviving English commanders from the great victories of the previous generation. He had fought under Henry V and had been one of the heroes of English resistance during France's reconquest. But he was also old, perhaps 75 to 80 years old, and operating under political pressure from England to hold Gascony at any cost. Talbot's plan, such as it was, relied on outdated tactics. He believed that if he could close quickly with the French before their artillery could effectively deploy, his armored knights and disciplined archers could break into the French camp and destroy the guns. This might have worked against traditional French armies, but it ignored the reality that the Bureau brothers had specifically designed their artillery park to defeat exactly this kind of attack. The guns were already deployed, already loaded, and already aimed at the approaches to the camp. All they needed was for the English to obligingly attack uphill across open ground into their killing zone. Talbot deployed his army at the base of the ridge, where the French artillery park was positioned. He organized his men-at-arms into cavalry formations and positioned his archers to provide supporting fire. Then, with remarkable and fatal haste, he ordered an immediate attack without proper reconnaissance of French positions or waiting for additional English forces that were en route. Some sources suggest Talbot was worried the French might retreat before he could engage them, which shows how completely he misunderstood the tactical situation. The French had no intention of retreating. They wanted Talbot to attack. The Bureau brothers had turned warfare into industrial killing, and they were eager to demonstrate their methods. When Talbot's cavalry began their charge up the ridge toward the French camp, the French artillery opened fire. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. 300 cannon firing in coordinated volleys created a continuous bombardment that no medieval army had ever experienced. The largest guns fired stone or iron balls weighing 20 to 60 lb. These projectiles traveled at perhaps 500 to 600 ft per second. When they hit an armored knight on a warrior, the impact was devastating. The cannonball would smash through plate armor, rupturing the body inside, and kill or the horse simultaneously. A single large cannonball could kill multiple men if they were in formation. The smaller culverins fired great shot or case shot, canvas bags or metal canisters filled with lead balls, nails, or scrap metal. When fired, these containers would burst, spraying hundreds of projectiles across a wide area, against massed infantry or cavalry at close range. Culverins created the effect of giant shotguns, cutting down dozens of men with each discharge. The English charge up the ridge was destroyed before it reached the French lines. Knights were blown from their saddles. Horses were disemboweled by cannonballs. Archers trying to advance behind the cavalry were shredded by grapeshot. The sound alone was terrifying. Continuous explosions, louder than anything most of these men had heard in their lives. The smoke from 300 black powder weapons created a fog that obscured vision and choked lungs. The smell of burning powder, blood, and burning flesh filled the air, and the English could not respond effectively. Their long bows, which had one searsuai and a quart, had a maximum effective range of perhaps 250 yards. The French artillery was firing from behind earthworks at 400 to 500 yd distance. English archers couldn't reach the guns, and even if they could, shooting arrows at men behind wooden ramparts and earth walls was futile. The English cavalry charging uphill into artillery fire was massacred. John Talbot, seeing his army being destroyed, made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. He personally led a mounted charge toward the French guns, attempting to break through by force of will and courage. He was 75 to 80 years old, but he was still a medieval knight who believed that valor and shock could overcome any obstacle. He rode toward the French earthworks with his household knights, ignoring the cannonballs that were killing men around him. He never reached the French positions. A cannonball struck his horse, killing it instantly. The animal collapsed, and Talbot in full plate armor was trapped beneath the dead weight. He was crushed by his own horse, unable to move. The French, seeing the famous English commander fallen, sent soldiers to capture or kill him. Talbot, pinned beneath his horse and helpless, was killed where he lay. His son, John Talbot the Younger, seeing his father fall, attempted to reach him and was killed in the same artillery bombardment. The deaths of both Talbots broke what remained of English morale. The army collapsed into rout. The slaughter at Castillon was methodical and industrial. The French artillery continued firing into the fleeing English, killing men as they retreated. French cavalry, which had been held in reserve, pursued the survivors, cutting them down as they fled toward Bordeaux. Contemporary sources estimate that perhaps 4,000 of Talbot's 6,000 men were killed, a casualty rate of 66%. Even accounting for exaggeration in medieval sources, this was clearly a catastrophic defeat. The battlefield after the fighting was described as covered with English dead, many with horrific wounds from artillery. Cannonballs had decapitated men, ripped off limbs, and left bodies burned and charred from gunpowder explosions. The bodies were left unburied for days, and the locals reported that the stench was unbearable. The survivors who reached Bordeaux brought news that ended English resistance in Gascony. Without Talbot and without an army, the English could not hold the region. Bordeaux surrendered to the French in October 1453, ending 300 years of English rule. The strategic consequences of Castillon were immediate and permanent. The 100 Years' War was over. England no longer had any realistic claim to French territory beyond Calais, which it would hold until 1558. The dream that had driven English foreign policy since 1337, that English kings could and should rule France, was dead. England's focus would turn inward, and within 2 years the Wars of the Roses would begin as English nobles who had been fighting in France turned their violence on each other in a struggle for the English throne. The psychological impact on England was profound. The country had invested enormous resources, blood, and national identity into the French war. The victories at Chivalry and Agincourt were central to English self-conception as a military power. Now, in one afternoon at Castillon, that self-conception was shattered. English knights, the finest warriors in Christendom, according to their own mythology, had been butchered by French guns operated by commoners. There was no glory in dying to artillery fire. There were no heroic duels or displays of chivalry. Men were simply blown apart from a distance by machines. The English nobility found this humiliating and traumatic. Many veterans of the French wars returned to England psychologically scarred, contributing to the instability that would erupt in the Wars of the Roses. For France, Castillon was vindication. Charles II, who had been on the verge of losing his kingdom to the English in 1429 before Joan of Arc saved Orleans, had now expelled the English entirely. France was unified under one king for the first time in a century. The French military reforms, including professional artillery and standing armies, had proven their worth. The Bureau brothers became heroes and were richly rewarded. Jean Bureau would continue serving as master of artillery and would participate in future French military campaigns. French monarchy emerged from the 100 Years' War stronger, more centralized, and with a professional military that would dominate European warfare for the next century. Castillon proved that the future belonged to gunpowder, professional soldiers, and state-funded armies, not to feudal cavalry and chivalric ideals. The medieval world was dying, and Castillon was one of the death blows. The technological and tactical lessons of Castillon were profound. Artillery had existed for over a century by 1453, but it had been unreliable, difficult to transport, and primarily useful for sieges. The Bureau brothers changed this by developing mobile artillery, professional gun crews, standardized ammunition, and defensive tactics that maximized artillery's advantages. Their entrenched artillery park at Castillon was a template for future warfare. By placing guns behind earthworks, they made artillery nearly invulnerable to cavalry charges while allowing continuous fire at attacking forces. This defensive-offensive combination, entrenched guns that could destroy attacking armies, would be refined over the following centuries and would reach its apotheosis in World War I trench warfare. Castillon demonstrated that traditional cavalry charges against prepared defensive positions with ranged weapons were obsolete. The English had not learned this lesson despite the fact that their own longbowmen had used similar tactics to destroy French cavalry at Chivalry and Agincourt. Now the French were using an even more devastating ranged weapon against the English. The age of chivalric warfare, where armored knights were the dominant force, was ending. The age of gunpowder, professional armies, and industrial killing was beginning. The human cost of Castillon was concentrated among the English military class. 4,000 English dead meant that virtually every noble family involved in the French wars lost someone. John Talbot's death was particularly symbolic. He was not just another commander, but a legendary figure, a man who represented the last generation of English heroes from the 100 Years' War. His death crushed beneath his horse after a futile charge against cannon symbolized the death of an entire way of warfare and an entire world view. The medieval ideal of knightly valor, where individual courage and martial skill determined victory, died with Talbot at Castillon. After 1453, wars would be won by whoever had better guns, more money, and larger professional armies. Individual heroism still mattered, but it was subordinate to industrial and organizational factors. This was a profound cultural shift that the English, French, and entire European military class struggled to accept. The mythology around Castillon developed differently than other Hundred Years' War battles. Agincourt became a celebrated English victory immortalized by Shakespeare. Castillon, by contrast, was quietly forgotten in English historiography. It was too humiliating, too final, and too clearly a defeat caused by English tactical incompetence to be celebrated. John Talbot became a tragic figure rather than a hero, remembered as the man whose obstinacy led to unnecessary slaughter. In French historiography, Castillon was celebrated as the final victory that expelled the English, but it was overshadowed by Joan of Arc's achievements at Orleans, which had more dramatic and supernatural elements. The Bureau brothers, despite their crucial role, never achieved the fame they deserved because artillerists were not considered as heroic as cavalry commanders. But military historians recognize Castillon as a pivotal battle because it demonstrated the tactical revolution that gunpowder was creating. After 1453, European warfare would never be the same. The archaeological and physical evidence from Castillon is limited because the battlefield has been built over during the following centuries. Unlike some medieval battlefields where mass graves have been found, Castillon's dead were apparently buried in multiple locations, and the exact positions of French and English forces remain somewhat uncertain. However, the French artillery park's location has been approximately identified, and the topography of the ridge makes clear why the English charge was so disastrous. Charging uphill across open ground against entrenched artillery was suicidal, and Talbot should have recognized this. His decision to attack immediately without reconnaissance or preparation has been condemned by military historians as one of the worst tactical decisions of the late medieval period. Some have argued that Talbot was under political pressure to achieve a quick victory and restore English morale, which clouded his judgment. Others suggest that at 75 to 80 years old, he was simply too old to adapt to the new realities of gunpowder warfare and was fighting the last war rather than the current one. On July 17, 1453, 300 French cannon commanded by the Bureau brothers systematically destroyed 6-0 English soldiers charging uphill into their killing zone. 4-0 Englishmen died in less than an hour, blown apart by cannonballs and grapeshot, unable to fight back effectively, killed by machines operated from behind earthworks. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, the English Achilles, the last great commander from Agincourt's generation, was crushed beneath his dead horse after a futile charge toward French guns. His son died trying to rescue him. Their bodies were recovered and later buried in England, but their deaths symbolized the end of England's dream of ruling France. The 100 Years' War was over. Gascony fell. Bordeaux surrendered. 300 years of English presence in France ended. Medieval warfare ended. The age of gunpowder began, and at Castillon on that July afternoon, the dream died in fire, smoke, and charred flesh, butchered by bronze cannon and French efficiency. The English knights who had terrorized Europe for a century learned that courage meant nothing against artillery, that chivalry was obsolete, and that the future belonged to those who mastered industrial killing. The bodies scattered across the field outside Castillon were not just dead soldiers. They were the corpse of an entire era. And the French guns that killed them were the instruments of a new age, darker and more terrible, where men would die in thousands not through sword and lance, but through explosion, fire, and mechanized slaughter. Castillon was the beginning of modern warfare, and it was written in charred English flesh.